We're live. We can see you and hear you.
Hello, everybody. This is the first policy section on roadmaps and visions. And we have 4 lectures, and the presenters are eagerly waiting in the waiting room to present their lectures. You all know how it works. You can make comments, ask questions, and I hope you will have a lot of learning and fun. So the first speaker will be Jaco Quist. Future Visioning for Sustainable Lifestyles and Green Economy. Jaco, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Jeroen, and many thanks to the organizers for bringing this all online so that we still can exchange our discussions and our conference. So really amazing what you have achieved over the last few months. So if you do have any questions, please write them down in the chat box. That will also, when I'm still doing the presentation, I'm not sure whether I can take a look at that, but that will help us to for the discussion in the end. And I will be talking today on future visioning for sustainable lifestyles and the green economy. I will talk about some results from cases from 7 European countries from the GLAMRS project, and my name is indeed Jaco Quist. So there are a few more co-authors on the slide. They are like key people in this visioning and workshop process, but actually the work has been done by a group between around 25 people who not could all list on this, but we're currently working on a paper where they will all be named. And I should say this work that I do present is based on one of the last FP7 projects. And this one is on the GLAMRS project, which stands for Transitions to Green Lifestyles, Alternative Economic Models and Upscaling Regional Sustainability. So let me move on to the next slide. So I'm going to talk about a few things, basics of the GLAMRS project, just to give you an idea what we have been doing. Then I will also say a few things more about lifestyles as part of that, before I will move on to the methodology for visioning those lifestyles using a backcasting approach. And then I will give you some results of that. And what is, say, specific or special about the work that I will present here today is that we focused differently from what most people do with vision scenarios. We focused most on the lifestyle part in the scenario and the visions, and also some relating that to economics and economic structures. And that's also something that you do not see so widely. So having said that all, let I move on. And I see that more people are entering. That's really good. So what was this GLAMRS project, this project on transitions to green lifestyles, alternative economic models, and upscaling regional sustainability? What was that all about? We worked on these topics at a level, well, in 7 European regions, where we both looked at the lifestyle at the regional level, say the scenarios at the regional level, but also we collaborated with local sustainability initiatives, so bottom-up initiatives, so that we were able to compare their lifestyles with the lifestyles at the regional level. And we all did that for different lifestyle categories. We were a rather big project. So we looked amongst others to the categories, the work-life balance, energy use in homes, mobility, food and nutrition, the use of products, and say the state of the home. And of course, you can also see where we did that all in Europe. Let me move on after having said that. Yes, of course, this conference is about low carbon lifestyles. And I just would like to mention that we don't have any agreement yet about how we define lifestyle. There are a range of lifestyle definitions around. And I just would like to show you, as part of the presentation, a few ones that you come across when you look on the internet. So lifestyles as a way of life, very concise one. Lifestyles as a more or less stable behavioral patterns. Lifestyles as observable social behavior, showing based on preferences. and a few more. It's not so important what is now the best one or the right one. I only would say that these have all been basis to work on definitions or descriptions for sustainable lifestyles. And I added one on the slide. Sorry, that there is not a source, but I took it from documents from the Marrakesh process on sustainable lifestyles and sustainable consumption. And that says that, okay, sustainable lifestyles is a way of living together, but then in a way that it also offers the possibilities or sufficient possibilities for future generations. But I'm just want to say that in order to move how we worked or approach the lifestyle in the Glamorous project, and that's what I show you on the next slide. And in our Glamorous project perspective on the lifestyles, we emphasize the patterns of time use. So what are the activities that people really do, and how do they spend their time, and in what locations are they done, and what are the associated consumption patterns during this time patterns. And we needed that to be able to link it to the environmental footprint or the environmental impact of these lifestyles. We also assume that infrastructures or the environmental impact of infrastructures should be part of that, and that you should also include the embedded carbon emissions. And of course, that is then being affected or being influenced by how people organize their daily life, their daily social practice. So having said that all, I will move on. Just giving a very quick overview of the regions again. We worked in Germany with the town of Halle. We worked in the Netherlands with initiatives in the cities of The Hague and Rotterdam. We worked in Galicia and Spain around A Coruña. We worked with Upper Austria, the Bohemian Danube Forest. We worked with university and initiatives in Western Romania, and we worked with Lazio in Rome, and we worked with initiatives and with the region of Aberdeen, so called Aberdeenshire. So that's where we worked both with the initiatives and also conducted our backcasting methodology for sustainable lifestyles and a green economy. And before I say a little bit more about that, I just would like to say, point to the initiatives that we worked with in the Netherlands. So, and on the one hand, we worked with repair cafes in several cities, in Delft, The Hague, and Rotterdam, and that linked then to the consumption category of product use. And we worked with a local energy initiative in The Hague, which was called Bird District Energetic. In Dutch, we call that Vogelwijk Energiek. And that was an initiative that both had an energy cooperative. They produced their own energy partly, but they were also like a community initiative, providing services and raising awareness among their neighborhood. And some of these people were also involved in the participatory backcasting workshops that we conducted in all these regions. And what I would like to say is that, backcasting is like a way to envision more sustainable or sustainable futures, in which you develop first where you want to go, so the future vision, before you look back, how you could have achieved that or how you could have reached that before working towards that. And for me, backcasting is very much a participatory thing that you do together with stakeholders. So I always talk about participatory backcasting that for me consists of three elements. So the key things are the people, so the stakeholders that you bring together, and by talking about them, by developing sustainable visions or visions for a sustainable future, they learn from that in terms of content, but they also learn from each other. What are the interests? What are the stakes? Where can we collaborate? Where are our mutual things? where our joint things. And if you do that in a good way, so if in a good way that you work with stakeholders that develop visions together and learn from that and from each other, you do not only get content results, so visions and assessments of the visions, you also get process results like learning and commitment among the stakeholders. And that's what you need to make an impact, that they will, so that the chances increase that they will bring or put it into practice. Going on quickly, I just show you a few visualizations of backcasting that you can find around on the internet. I do not really go into that, but I would like to say, in addition to these nice visualizations that just show our reflections of different varieties of how you can backcasting use, you also need a stepwise approach or a method out of that, because it's not only about the principles, it is also about, well, what to do next in time. So what is your timeline to bring the process towards a good end? Having said that, we put that into the, say, discussion we had within the Glamours project, where we wanted to develop this vision methodology for sustainable lifestyles and a green economy at a regional level, say, building on what was already available with regard to backcasting methods. So as we did a lot of the things of the basic analysis elsewhere in the project, we decided to use backcasting mainly as a workshop tool. Of course, you do need some basic orientating analysis, problem orientation, you need scenario assessments, but we did that elsewhere in the project. And with regard to the assessments, I will say a little bit more later on. So we decided to do that in 2 series of workshops. The first series was dedicated to making visions. The second series was dedicated to assessing those visions, but also to turning that into policy recommendations and pathways towards the vision. And we did that then mainly in the qualitative sense, because the assessments of that were done later on in other parts of the project. So when you do this together with stakeholders, you also get a kind of co-production of knowledge. And we wanted to work both with, say, green growth-like initiatives, but not alone, but also with representatives from the degrowth movement and sufficiency actors, which included our local initiatives that we were working with. What we thought was also important, that you would get diversity in our visions. So not only as realistic as possible, or the dominant policy view on that, or the policymaker view on that, but also more the bottom-up and the more alternative views. And that's why we wanted to distinguish between, well, green growth debate, discourse on the one hand, and the sufficiency and degrowth debate on the other hand. And that's what I would like to say a little bit more about. And so that was like a design choice for us, that we wanted to have visions and scenarios on both of these profiles. And when you look for images, they're still a bit similar, but green growth was for us, could be characterized by ecological modernization. So solving the environmental, or reducing the environmental impact while keeping lifestyles and wealth as much as possible the same. And concepts related to that and fit in that are eco-efficiency, solving, while reducing environmental impact by technology and innovation. A circular economy is definitely a concept that fits into that, but also the bio-based economy. Also an emphasis on market-based solutions to improve or reduce the environmental impact, and quite a few things that relate that are now in the sharing economy, and partly prosumers that bring that what they presume also in the market situation. But we wanted to contrast that with more degrowth thinking and sufficiency thinking, and there I would say the environmental impact reduction would originate or would be based on consuming less, working less working hours, but also getting higher levels of well-being. So that would stand or reflect a more moderate type or more simple life, but it would give you more community cohesion, and in that sense, and in other senses, also higher levels of well-being. That will also include unpaid work or community services that will be based on the thinking, but also huge contributions by local citizens and community initiatives that would include much from collaborative consumption and partly also prosumers and material services. So that was our thinking, but we did not know, do our stakeholders that we did invite to our workshops, did they think in a similar way? And that's where I would like to go next to, after clicking through this slide that gives the terms also that I just talked about. So what we did as an example in the Netherlands, that we had these two workshops by the end of 2015 and also in 2016 for the second workshop. And we found a nice location to have these people discuss all these items and work on these visions. And we did that in a more structured way. So we had broader issue discussions. We worked on vision generation. We did some backcasting by asking backcasting questions. So what changes are needed to achieve this, and how can these changes be achieved, and who should do that? And we generated, or we gathered all these, we recorded all these results, and we compiled that into a report or an accounts that we could use for the second round, where we first discussed the visions and then evaluated. We did some more backcasting. How can we achieve those visions, and what do we need to do to achieve that on the short and long term? So trying to put that into pathways. Having said that, I just would like to say that we developed three visions in the Netherlands. One was entitled Sufficiency in Local Communities, that had a huge degrowth and sufficiency content. We had a third vision that's here on the bottom right, that was very much based on green growth, but building on innovative and active citizens. And there was a third vision that focused very much on responsible individuals that would survive themselves, or that would become greener themselves by solving in different networks that did not have to be the same all the time. I was myself a bit more critical on that. I was not so sure whether that wasn't a step back instead of a step forward, but it just came out of our participants in our workshop. And I'm afraid I don't have much time to go deep more in that, but I can say actually much more about it. I don't do that because I would like to say something how that works for in total with the other countries. Here I show you some overview of the visions that were developed throughout Europe in the entire project, but it's much better to show the overview just in this graph where we actually clustered them. And what we did find is that based on how we had organized, we had a cluster of urban sufficiency visions, we had a cluster of urban green growth visions, and we had a cluster of, say, rural sufficiency visions. And that was interesting for a project because then we could also start comparing what was in it, and can we aggregate that, and can we use that to make larger discussions and put that into policy proposals that we can feed into the EU. And this is just one example in how we did aggregate. We actually compiled the backcasting results, so what need to be changed, and we aggregated them across the countries. I cannot tell you the details. That's much more for another story or for another paper that we're still working on. And then I already can say something about the conclusions, which is that, okay, we were successful in developing this backcasting methodology for sustainable lifestyles in the green economy. And we did apply that, and we found some similarities across our 7 cases, as well as quite some diversity. We clustered those visions, and we did see that sustainable lifestyle options and the local initiatives were important in all visions and all pathways. We also found that, remarkably, that when it comes to the technologies that you need to bring about those visions, so of more sustainable lifestyles in the green economy, that they to a large extent built on the very same eco-technologies, but that they got rather different shapes. So solar panels and how you organize their use in a sufficiency society is quite different from how you organize that in a green growth market-oriented society. So we did that just to show that it put sufficiency and degrowth better on the societal and the policy agendas. Not that we have to go per se that way, but that at least it should be better considered, and that there are also benefits to get from that. And that's what I say. What did we then do with that? Well, in some cases, these workshops and processes were used to create follow-up implementation. And in other parts of the project, those results were used for further analysis. So it was used for agent-based modeling. They did that in Scotland. It was brought into environmental modeling. Actually, that will be presented tomorrow by Gibran Vita in this conference too. And it was also fed into economic modeling. And there we had lots of discussions because that did not work so well. I think I should leave it here, and I don't talk so much on the policy relevance that may come from the questions in the chat box. So thank you very much for listening here, and I will now also look into the chat box, and I give the floor back to Jeroen.
Thank you very much, Jaco, for an interesting lecture. We have several questions. Let's go through some of them. And as I said before, try to give short, pointy answers so we can deal with a lot of. Okay.
Yeah, I see that many of the questions are about, can you tell more about the details? And I will share my slides, and there you will find links also to the reports.
I hear feedback on my own voice. I don't know what's happening with the delay.
Can you hear me, Jeroen?
The method. Can you say more?
Yeah, I say I go to.
I can hear you, but there's feedback. I have feedback. I don't know why.
Yeah. Yes, I can say more about the method. So one of the methodological questions that I do see is that how did it then link with the economic modeling? And that was exactly what I didn't have time to say more about. So we had some microeconomic and macroeconomic modelers in the project. And say the macroeconomists worked with their models and said, and then you always get, okay, green growth gives well, no, new innovations and allowing to grow, it gives more wealth. So the very traditional view on economics, while the degrowth alternatives scored much lower on that because the parameters where they are evaluated in the current economic models, that they do not well. So we had discussions. This is actually a limited answer. So this shows that actually the limitations of the existing models, and we rather should have like new economic models that were, for instance, built on the principles of eco-villages, so that you get also economic models around that have in their assumptions more from degrowth in it compared to now, but that must be quite a lot of work. I look through the questions. I see here a question on whether backcasting is applicable to scale up the number of people who can imagine alternative sustainable lifestyles. If this question is about how can you scale up and people that can contribute to that, then I think that, say, internet ways can be good ways to work on that. Otherwise, there is always a limitation to how large you can make these stakeholder workshops and how many people can you gather. And there you have some efficiency issues. So you might better actually develop these visions not in too large groups, but in very diverse groups, and find ways to communicate and assess them using internet-based tools, I think. And that can be a good way to collaborate. What we also do know from these methods is that if you connect better or collaborate better with authorities of people with influence, organizations with decision-making power, you also have better ways to involve more people and achieve more impacts with these kind of visioning methods.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. So then we will now to the next lecture. We're still quite good on time. Lecture by Mathieu Saugeot for a better integration of lifestyle changes in decarbonization pathways. Are you ready,
yes.
Mathieu?
Yes, thank you.
The floor is yours.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Very pleased to be with you online today for this conference. Thanks again to the organizer for making this online conference possible. Just to say that our contribution is going to be close from the keynote of Céline Guibarch this morning, and I hope that I will provide additional elements also to continue the discussion. So a few words about us. Who are we and why this question? I work at IDRI with my colleague Henri. IDRI is a policy research institute, and we are a think tank based in Paris. CIRED is the lab of Céline Guibarch, so a research unit with a good experience in pathways mitigation modeling. And we are interested into mitigation pathways because we observed that those are like quite key policy relevant tools that has been used for years and years to inform policy making, to support debates, to frame debates. And so the start was on those type of research because we think that they are key to frame our vision of low carbon future. The perspective of the presentation is really the one of science policy interface, is really to discuss the interactions between the methodologies to produce knowledge on low carbon future and the way they are going to be discussed, interpreted, used in the policy sphere. So I think this research is very much influenced by our role as a think tank at the national, so the French level, where we are integrated and we work with the central state, and also the role of my colleagues on the international negotiation. So just to share this perspective. What I'm going to present to you has been published in our collection at IDRI in a study in French. There is also a short paper in English on our website, and we are going to submit an academic article on this too. So very quickly, because the time is short, the introduction. Actually, many things have been said this morning by Céline, but just the beginning of our research is, of course, the growing interest for lifestyle changes within the framework of decarbonization pathways, and of course, this conference is a good illustration of this. We can identify many reasons why we have this growing interest, and again, it has been said a bit this morning, linked also with the IPCC expertise. Just I want to underline the two questions. I think the two key questions of our research is that there is this growing interest for lifestyle changes, but we can observe, however, that it's not so obvious and consensual because we observe that there is a political dimension linked to lifestyle changes, maybe more than technical changes. And so we have this question, how to deal with this dimension. And we also observe that it's quite difficult to identify the most appropriate approaches that we can use to generate assessment for a low carbon future. So those are the two key questions we were interested. I'm gonna say a few words about our method and what we did. I'm not going to to go into too much details, but the idea is to give you an idea where we are talking from, what we looked at, and then move to the discussions and the key ideas. So our goal was to better understand the political and scientific implications of considering those lifestyle changes in mitigation pathways. So for that, we wanted to combine concrete analysis of a lot of scenarios. So we identified more than 70 scenarios at the French, European, international level. But we were also interested in the science policy interface. So we did also interviews, so around 16 interviews with the practitioners who are involved actually in scenario making process. Or people who model things or use the models or use the scenarios, and it was mainly in the French context. So, as I said, in our world sample, it was more than 70 scenarios. And here I just present 3 typical scenarios to give you an idea of the type of scenario, the pathways we were looking at. And of course, those 3 scenarios are some of the recent scenarios that integrate lifestyle changes, because when you look at the last 10, 20 years, many, of course, mitigation pathways did not integrate really the lifestyle changes, as it has been said also before. So the first scenario is Grubler and co-authors that Céline talked about this morning. It was one of the family of scenario in the last 1.5 IPCC report. So it's the work of an academic team, and the spatial level is global. The second scenario is the European Climate Foundation. So it's an NGO. They produce a scenario at the European level with the idea to contribute to the European political debates on the strategy, the long-term strategy. And the last one, at the national level, it's the French strategy, so the French low-carbon roadmap. And so it has been produced by the administration, and it was used to update our national low-carbon strategy. So the idea was to look at those very different type of pathways, but the common point is that all these pathways were produced in order to inform policymaking, and in part can say that they did, and they were some was very close from the policymaking as the French strategy, and some were further, but they share the same purpose. So I will highlight 3 type of results, and then the idea is to spend more time on the discussion. The first result we wanted to show in our study is just to answer the question, what does it mean for those pathways, those methodologies, to explore lifestyle changes? And here this table is an overview, portfolio of the assumptions that have been considered. And here we also identify the type of change. But here the idea is not to discuss the details, but just to give an idea of what are in these scenarios. And the common practice consists in identifying changes in mobility, consumption, housing practices, food, and on the other hand, to formulate assumptions that enable to quantify their effect on the whole system. And this quantification generally applies to activity level indicators. So that was just a very factual result. The second result was to understand how those lifestyle change had been explored in these methodologies. And we observed that even if there is a variety of modeling tools, you have quite a common approach, and I think it's also what Céline said this morning, with a global and qualitative reflection process, then that goes through an interpretation exercise to be integrated in the modeling exercise. And of course, with this very classic standard approach, you have limits, because this involves the reductive prism of modeling tools. Of course, you need to analyze lifestyle change in a framework that exists before this goal. And of course, this framework is fairly constrained by the modeling structure. So for example, if you think about mobility practices, you won't have detailed indicators that would be needed to discuss what are the lifestyle change about. If you have just aggregated number of kilometers, for example, it's not easy to have a discussion about daily mobility in 2050 low carbon future, for example. And the other limit we observed is that certain assumptions were precisely described and others were not completely explicit. I think it just shows that it's the beginning of the integration also of these lifestyle changes in those big modeling framework. And so sometimes it's possible, sometimes more difficult to describe precisely the figures and what's happened. And again, we look into this not from a technical perspective, but from a political perspective, is that if you want to organize a workshop between stakeholders for the next French national strategy, low carbon strategy, for example, you will need sometimes some details to feed the collective discussion. And the third result was to trying to observe and identify the purpose, the why we should explore lifestyle changes in those particular pathways. And here, those are quite general benefits when you think about foresight exercise, when you think about scenarios. The first one is to observe that actually it helps to take a broader view of the possible future. Since demand is a dimensioning variable, when you change the assumption of demand, for example, energy demand in the Grubler and Clauser's scenario, or when you change the food diets in the many studies on the future of agriculture, then you make it possible to explore alternative pathways. For example, if you think about the future of Europe agro-food system, if you think about agroecology, you will have lesser, smaller yields, and so less production. So if you don't have a food diet change in the same time, you can't explore these alternative pathways. Whereas it's important for the policy debate to have a broad vision of the different future. The second benefit we observe is that and I think it has been said also before, usually in pathways, you have a focus on technical change and economical changes. And just to say that the demand, that the lifestyle change, that you can have assumption on it, maybe it's not very precise, but at the political level, it's important because it just reminds that the transition is going to be technical, going to be economical, but it's going to be a social also transition. And so it contributes to reaffirming the social nature of the transition. The third benefit is about SDGs, and Céline said it also this morning, that when you look at different type of scenarios with different level of demand and lifestyle changes, it shows that some scenarios, even if they are the same, when you look from the climate perspective, 1.5 degree scenario, for example, but when you look the synergies and the trade-offs with the SDGs, it's very different. So we really think that to incorporate this social dimension is also very useful in order to have a better discussion with the SDGs. And the last one is something that we observe in different exercises in France, is to have portraits, ideal types, archetypes of households. So to have a concrete description of what is the daily life in 2050, for example. And we think that is very useful to root the transition into everyday life. So those are benefits we think that it's potential the benefits for the policy relevancy of those pathways, meaning that if we're able to integrate lifestyle this way, it could be useful for the policy debates. But in the same times, we observe, and I think that's a key discussion, that it challenges the methodologies, and methodologies is also a key for the policy relevancy. So we have a kind of a paradox here. We have challenges, and it's something that I'm going to present now. We observe two key challenges when you want to integrate lifestyle change in those pathways. The first one is about policy neutrality. Actually, what it's in the literature, in our interviews, but you can also see in the way scenarios have been written, you see that when you incorporate lifestyle change, you challenge the value neutrality of the pathways. Lifestyles are about values, they're about preferences, they're about social and individual representation. And so when you make assumptions about this change, sometimes it's not consensual and sometimes it's difficult to prove. So we have, for example, in France, the experience of an NGO that is producing a scenario on sufficiency for 20 years. And they explain how it is difficult to present this scenario in political debate. So that's a challenge. But when you think about it, standard pathways, like classic pathways, are neutral only in appearances, and because they all make assumptions about future lifestyles, even if it's not explicit. So we think that this challenge is important, but I think it's true for every types of pathways, and it means for us that we need to better address the interactions between science and policies. The second challenge we see, and also it's linked to the literature and also about our interviews, is more a scientific challenge. Of course, a large part of what is about lifestyle, this concept, still remains outside the scope of modeling, because it calls for a plurality of disciplines. And when you're in a field where usually, generally, it has been dominated by economists, by engineers, I'm both, there is a lack of representation of social sciences, and it's what we usually, generally, observe in the consortium, even if there are, of course, exceptions. So it calls for a better dialogue and work together between disciplines. But when you look at examples and you talk to practitioners and you look at the literature, you can understand that it's not going to be easy, because there are approaches that are very different, and the article of Hills and Causers is very helpful in this vision. There are epistemic differences between social sciences, engineering, modeling sciences, economics, etc. So it's not so easy to just bring social scientists into the existing framework and to say, okay, you have a lot of knowledge about lifestyle change, and you're gonna help us to introduce this knowledge in our current framework and modeling, etc. So we think that it's an open question, but it's a very important one. And we are working also with the community to identify what we can do on this. So to sum up, we think that exploring lifestyle change in mitigation pathways can increase their policy relevance, but we need to overcome these challenges. We think that it's important to not only think about the improvement of models, because we think that there are constraints in their analytical decomposition framework, and because if you just have an incremental improvement, sophistication of models, we are not sure you answer actually the political and scientific challenges. And we also think that actually we need to think about the scope of relevance of the models, because, and somebody said it very clearly this morning during the keynote, to say like models are already really complex, so how to integrate and remain in the same time understandable. So We think there is a discussion also around the role of the model. We think that modeling tools are very important because they can be a useful instrument for the integration, for the dialogue, but they shouldn't be seen as the cornerstone of the pathway development framework. And so at the end, we think that, and my colleague Henri Weisman developed this in a paper previously, that we can design richer approaches to develop pathways. We need translation toolkits between different languages, between different disciplines. And we think that this is working on the overall method that could allow us to overcome this kind of scientific and political challenges. And just to finish, so we think that there are many promises in the literatures on the recent studies to integrate lifestyle change. We think that it's important to link the work on the methodologies with a reflection on the policy context, because we think that we absolutely need to take into account the goal to be policy relevant when you're thinking about a new methodology. And as I said, we are starting a collective work in France with the community of modelers, social scientists, to also explore the new methodologies that exist. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mathieu. So we have some questions. Let's start with the questions by Charlie Wilson and Benjamin, who agree a bit. Charlie Wilson says that you refer to a study by Grubler et al., which was referred to also in other lectures, but that study doesn't mention lifestyles or lifestyle change. I think that's interesting because you also said that a lot of models have been developed not for the purpose of analyzing lifestyle change, but they are being used now. And do you think that a lot of studies in the past were really about lifestyle change, but they did not use that name actually?
Very good question, because it's true that you need to use a word, and some people talk about demand, about behavior change, about lifestyles, about social patterns. So it's true that in all the scenarios we looked at, these different words and concepts were used. So it's true that we use lifestyle change because we consider that it's a concept that is useful to gather all those concepts. But of course, there is discussion between, depending on the discipline you're looking at, you won't use the same word. But I think also concerning the question of Charlie, it's true that it's an interpretation also of the change, for example, for the paper of Grubler and co-authors, that when you look at the change in the demand, you have to think about the lifestyle changes that are behind this, even if, and I agree, it's not talked exactly this way in this particular paper.
Thank you. Theo has a related point. Do you know if modelers usually create a framework to answer a specific question about lifestyle changes, or rather explore changes that can be easily implemented in pre-existing robust models? What do you think is the best approach?
It's a very good question. It was also a question we had, and that's why we looked into those different scenarios. And overall, what we observe is that they use pre-existing robust models. Because in general, the models were existing, they are heavy tools, and so the new questions arise, and sometimes you just change a little bit the models. But of course, there are some initiatives where like the model is changed a bit more. But I think the point you highlight is very important. Every model has been built to explore some specific questions at the beginning. And even if as a modeler you want sometimes to broaden this the scale of the question you want to think about it, it's one model can't do everything. So, and I think I liked the answer of Céline this morning, because she highlighted some very precise questions that her model, her IAM model, could answer linked to lifestyle change, and not so many other questions that could be interesting.
Okay, Joelle has a point. I think your questions would be interesting to address towards the whole conference in the discussion channel of the forum. Okay, I think we should stop here because it's 4:15 and the next speaker is planned. Would like to thank you, Mathieu, for your interesting lecture. And so we move on now to the last lecture of this session by Claire Henner with the title Translating 1.5 degrees Celsius Scenarios into Low Carbon Lifestyles. Claire, the floor is yours.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So I'm Claire Hanmer, and now I've introduced myself, I'm going to turn my video off because my internet connection is not so brilliant. But my presentation is going to pick up, I hope, very nicely from several of the themes in the previous presentation. And in particular, this idea of translating. How do we take these global scenarios and actually translate this into something that's meaningful for individual households when we're talking about low carbon lifestyles? So I'm going to be talking about some work that Charlie Wilson and I have been doing on this. We both work at the Tyndall Centre and are based at the University of East Anglia. So I'm going to start by introducing the CAST Centre, which this research has been carried out as part of. Introduction to integrated assessment models, and then move on to talk about how to actually translate output from those models into information about lifestyle changes for individual households. And I'll be working through a particular example looking at heating in the UK, and then finish up by talking a bit about the wider relevance of the method that we're developing. So the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations, or CAST for short, has been set up to look at social transformations needed to achieve deep emissions reductions. It's headed up by Lorraine Whitmarsh, who'll be giving a keynote talk on Friday, so I won't go into too much detail on the project right now. But I'm working as part of the visioning theme and about how to communicate the impact of climate change on the lifestyles of the general public. And the work I'm doing will be feeding through into the deliberative workshops with members of the public that Caroline Verfueth will be talking about some more in her presentation tomorrow. And in the project, we're focusing on 4 main areas which are big generators of emissions and themes that have already come up many times today: food and diet, material consumption, mobility, and heating and cooling. Now, for this audience, I think many of you will know very well what I'm talking about with integrated assessment models, or IAMS for short, and how that these are sophisticated models that are representing interactions between the society, the biosphere, and the climate system, and that they're linking economic processes, climate, land use, energy use, and population. And you'll also be very familiar with the fact that these models are used to look at different scenario projections. For instance, what would it take to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C without negative emissions technologies? So what are the benefits of using output from these IAM models for lifestyle research? Obviously, one of the really important things is the fact that the IAMs are using the models of global climate. So we can see the impact of energy use on temperature rise for the whole globe in a way that we just can't if we're looking at models that are looking at one country only. As many of you will be familiar, energy demand is a very key variable in the IAM modelling. So the energy services that people are using as part of their lifestyles can be identified within the input and output of these models. And the models are balancing between reducing the energy use and decarbonising energy supplies, and coming up with a trade-off between the two. So it's you can easily use these models to show just how important both strands, both reducing demand and decarbonising the energy supply, are. But again, those of you who are familiar with the models will know that the output comes at global in terms of global regions. For instance, looking at the electricity use for the whole of the residential and commercial sector in Western Europe might be one of the outputs that we get. So how can we translate that information into information for households, for example, in the UK? So I'm going to run through a methodology that tries to address this question. And what we're looking at is a step, five different steps, all beginning with D, where we take that regional final energy use from the IAM, disaggregate it. So in some cases, for instance, disaggregating between commercial and residential use, downscaling it to the country level to allocate the emissions to the countries within the region, and then decomposing it to the different fuel uses for each form of energy service. So when I'm talking about energy services, that might be something like providing mobility or providing thermal comfort. And obviously you can provide those services in different ways. Thermal comfort might be in terms of some people would have gas heating, some people would have electric heating, for instance. And then looking to differentiate to look at the emissions from specific household archetypes, so typical representative households which people can identify with, and to describe the pathways that those households would need to take in order to reach the scenario output in 2050 or whenever the future date the scenario is looking at the projections. So for an example of thermal comfort in the UK, what we were doing was disaggregating this regional final energy use for residential and commercial energy for all of Western Europe to take out the space heating energy use from that energy use, and then downscaling it to allocate the share of that space heating to the UK. We were then decomposing that space heating energy use to different types of heating services, gas, electric, district heating, and so on, and differentiating the housing stock into different housing archetypes and looking at the energy use and emissions for each archetype, and using data from the IAMs to describe the pathways that these archetypes need to follow in order to meet the scenario. So in terms of housing archetypes, the aim is to divide up the UK's housing stock to come up with some typical types of homes which most people can identify with. Now, what I've done for the UK housing stock is a very simple division into 4, where it's basically splitting homes by their size and by their age. So in one group, I've got the larger homes, what in many countries will be referred to as single family homes. So we talk about detached or semi-detached homes. And in the other category, I've got smaller homes, so terrace houses, flats and apartments. And there's also a division in age. Obviously, the older houses were built to older building standards, have less insulation and are less airtight, so need more energy per square metre. And I've taken a cut-off point of 1980, which is a point at which the UK building regulations shifted to ask for a better insulation. So that divides up the overall housing stock into 4. So this next slide shows the results of taking the energy use for 2010 and dividing that up among the archetypes. Now, there's quite a few different things to talk about on this slide. So if I start by explaining the axes, the x-axis is the floor area. So the total is the total floor area for all the housing in the UK, and each bar for each of the 4 archetypes will show you the total floor area that each archetype occupies. So the larger, older houses are the biggest share of the floor area. The y-axis shows the heating energy intensity in terms of kilowatt hours per metre squared, and that differs with the older houses using more energy per metre squared than the newer ones, but also the larger houses using more energy per meter squared than the smaller ones for the heating. And then the final division that I've got is by fuel. Now, the vast majority of homes in the UK are heated using natural gas, and that's the blue bars. But you can also see that there are some homes heated by electricity, and a noticeable proportion of the large older homes are heated by oil. This is normally homes that don't have a connection to the gas grid. Now, what happens when we move to 2050? In the next slide, I'm showing results for these archetypes, which are based on a particular 1.5 degree scenario. So we're taking an image 1.5 degree scenario with minimal BECS and including some lifestyle changes. So this is quite a stringent scenario, and the first thing I think you'll notice is that this y-axis is the same y-axis as the previous slide. It shows just how much the energy use per meter squared has to drop across the whole building stock, and we've taken the whole building stock down to the same level. There is also the model is projecting an increase in the overall floor area between 2010 and 2050. So 2 new archetypes for large new build and small new build have been added. The other big change that happens up to 2050 is that there are many more there's a big shift away from the gas heating. There's only a small amount of gas left towards electric heating. And it's envisaged that would mostly be electric heat pumps. But there's also a role within the smaller homes for district heating, which is currently a very small proportion of the heating for UK homes. So that I've shown you the graphs based on IM output for the energy use. Those can also be translated to look into, well, what does this mean in terms of the emissions from the different homes? And here we see an even more radical change between 2010 and 2050. You can see here, each fuel has different emissions in terms of amounts of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So in 2010, the electricity emissions per kilowatt hour are quite a bit higher than the gas emissions are. However, in 2050, when the scenario is envisaging an almost complete decarbonisation of the electricity supply, those electricity emissions are dropping close to zero. While the residual gas emissions, the homes still on gas are dropping in their emissions a lot because they become a lot more efficient, but there is still some residual emissions here. So in terms of actually turning these quite complicated graphs, which are for the whole of the UK building stock, into a narrative to talk to members of the public about what this means for for their household. We're thinking in terms of developing pathways, pathway narratives, where we're talking about a particular archetype and how that particular type of household is going to need to shift in the 40-year period. So I've drawn a line on the graph here that shows one example, which is looking at a large older house which currently has oil heating, and how that would need to shift to using an electric heat pump, and that would have a major impact in terms of the emissions generated by that particular household. So when we're talking about these particular pathways, we can also think in terms of the avoid, shift and improve framework, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which is particularly used in mobility scenarios. So in terms of avoiding, well, that's obviously reducing the floor area on the x-axis, and improving is improving the efficiency or the energy intensity on the y-axis. But then the shifting is shifting to a different fuel, a different type of energy service. So it's in the terms of these graphs, it's changing the color of the bar that of the different energy service. In terms of actual impact on the lifestyle, so what do these changes actually mean for the people living in these homes? So there's two major changes which hopefully it's been obvious from the previous slides need to take place. It's not just about changing the heating system and the fuel used, it's also that major changes in fabric for the existing homes and much higher standard newer homes is needed. And the figures based on this 1.5 degree scenario show that actually we need to take all the building stock, including all the older existing buildings, to something really quite close to a passive house standard. Now, I won't go into all the details of what you might need to do. There's a diagram here that shows some of the features of the additional insulation, the changes in ventilation that will be needed in order to actually upgrade those homes so that they need a lot less energy in the first place. And that would be noticeable in terms for the occupants of the houses in terms of lower temperature fluctuation, changes in ventilation and so on. Now, they would also probably notice that they had a different response from their heating system. People used to gas heating with a gas boiler, are used to a very rapid response, and most UK homes have quite a big temperature fluctuation between day and night during the winter in the UK. While it's much, if they're running a heat pump in a well-insulated house, they'd have a much steadier temperature. And people in the UK sometimes don't like to have warm temperatures at night, for instance. If they're using district heating, that's a big change for people who are used to having a boiler in their house under their own control to move to some more communal system of heating. And in both cases, these new heating systems would need peak demand management to shift the patterns of heating, which again would change what's happening in terms of what the occupants notice about their heating systems. The residents are likely to need to understand rather more complex heating and ventilation controls and accept the fact that those controls might be shifting the heating demand in time, for instance. So I've talked through in some detail one particular example of looking at a house in the UK and what's happening with thermal comfort. Within the CAST project, what we want to do is look more widely than this across different energy services. And what we're hoping is the basic methodology that's been developed can be applied across a wide range of things. We'll be looking not just at heating, but also at cooling, though residential cooling should not be relevant in the UK, but certainly some of the other areas we're looking at, like for instance in China and Brazil, it will be very important. We'll be looking at mobility and all the different ways that people can use transport. We'll also be looking at material consumption and at food and diet. And for food and diet, we'll need to be including other greenhouse gas emissions as well as CO2. And what we're hoping is that this method will have a wider potential application. Now we've developed it, it could be applied to a wide variety of different scenario outputs and hopefully be of use for both a policy audience, but also for the modelling community to take output from models and look at how to translate this into things that are meaningful for individual households. So thank you very much. I'd be very happy to take any questions, and I'll turn the camera back on.
Yeah, Claire, thanks a lot for this interesting lecture. And we still have some time. I think we have 7 minutes, 8 minutes, so everything works perfectly in that sense. I have here a question of Ivan Savin. He says he likes the idea to connect macro IAMs to the micro data. However, what do you think about the general criticism to AEMs with respect to their limitations to accommodate boundedly rational agents, more realistic risk perception and technological change? Wouldn't it be better to move to a more flexible framework like agent-based modeling? I would like to add that agent-based models allow for social interactions, which seem to be an important dimension behind lifestyle changes. So what's your idea about this?
Well, I'm not a modelling specialist, so I can't really comment on the practicalities and the difficulties of incorporating different types of modelling. Within the CAST project, we're working very closely with the image team in the Netherlands. We've already seen some references to papers from the group there, who I think are thinking very hard about just how do you incorporate lifestyle changes into the IAM modelling. But I'm afraid I don't know the technicalities of exactly what kind of modelling that they're planning in future. I know the 1.5 degree scenario that I was talking about, it did have a number of lifestyle things incorporated, but they were quite naturally limited, both because you have to be working at a very high scale with these very complex, large international models, global models, and also because there are some things about lifestyles that are just that bit easier to fit into the existing modeling framework.
Okay, just a question from my side. There's also a lot of attention for modeling adaptation and mitigation in the context of real climate change. And for the UK, for instance, you should expect higher temperatures in the future, which is maybe good news in terms of energy use for heating. Does your study take that into account, or could it take that into account, or should it take that into account?
I agree it should, and we're lucky because the IAM output we're using, it does actually, because it has the climate model incorporated within the IAM, it's actually seeing a reduction in the heating degree days over time. So that is actually built into the IAM and part of the feedback loops that are already there. And I mean, on the subject of cooling, because several colleagues have said, well, perhaps we also ought to be including cooling in future, even in the UK. I would feel quite strongly that that's a building design issue, and that if buildings are properly designed in the UK, we shouldn't need cooling, even as the temperature does warm.
Indeed, good point, yeah. I don't see any more questions at this moment. Maybe you are suffering from being the last person in the session. I'm just checking, but no, I don't see any other questions. So I think we are also 1 minute before the final time. So I think it's good to stop here and to thank the 4 speakers for their participation and all the participants for their interesting discussion and questions. There is now one question from Sam. But what about cooling for commercial properties? For instance, glass-fronted offices.
And certainly that, well, there's already a very high cooling load in the UK for cooling commercial premises. We were specifically focusing on the energy in the residential energy, and that was part of the decomposition that we were doing, or the disaggregation that we were doing. So we were only looking at the household energy use. Efficiency in cooling is important for commercial. Definitely.
Yeah, that's clear. Okay, thanks to Sam for filling this last minute. And so I think we're come then to an end of this interesting session, the first policy section. There will be several ones more. And as you know, on Discord, you can continue discussing with the authors and raise questions and get answers. So I recommend everybody to look there. Franziska Klein put a link to go directly there if you're not sure how to get there. So thank you once again, everybody, and we'll see each other later. Bye-bye.